welcome to another episode of Atelier TV. Today I'm here with amazing painter Vanessa Barbe. Hello Vanessa.
Hello.
We are sitting in Vanessa's dad's studio, which is, as you can see, amazing. For those who can't see, this is a lifelong collection of taxidermy and resin.
Embedded, yeah.
And it's absolutely mind-blowing sitting here. So it's such an honor to sit here and talk art and life with Vanessa. So we are based in Jervis Bay, and I know your family has a very big history and love affair with Jervis Bay and Vincentia. Maybe we should start there. What do you think?
Yes, well, my mother's parents, Gloria and Keith Shee, they came to Vincentia in the mid-50s, and they established the first post office in the area, which was down in a little, quite an old little hut that's still in the area down the road at the boat ramp. So the Vincentia boat ramp's actually the end of the Wool Road, which was a long trade route. It was an Indigenous trade route originally, but it goes from the boat ramp all the way up to Goulburn, and was used to transport the wool bales down to ships in the 19th century. And down there was this little old hut, and that's where they had a little corner store, and my grandparents, and the first mail contract for the area. So they were the only family at that time living in Vincentia, so they sort of started the community up in a way from that period. And my mother and her three brothers grew up here, and yeah, it was amazing having all the beaches to themselves for a period of time. It wasn't until the 1960s that other families started moving into the area and it started growing. But as you can see now, in a few generations, it's become quite well established in terms of population and yes, overdevelopment. Yes, so there is a bit of history in the area, and we have all the old post office relics and things. Really museum pieces now. They use digital scales now, whereas they have the old metal scales, hand scales, and yeah, that's pretty amazing.
That's pretty amazing to have sort of your own pioneer family.
Yeah, that's right.
When I traveled through Kangaroo Valley a lot, I just love that area.
Yeah.
And there were some of the photos of the olden days where they used to brought all the big ice blocks. Would that be that is it the same period that your family was here, where the lighthouse was inhabited by those few families?
I think that was in the 19th century, early 20th century, and then I don't think my family, well, my mother would know more about what they had in terms of facilities. I think it was pretty stripped back. They had to get water from the creek, and to top up when they had no water in the water tanks, they had to. I don't think they had a fridge. No.
Sounds amazing to me.
Yeah, they started out, but eventually the 60s came, and I think once the 60s were here, there was a lot more electrical appliances, and they eventually got the sewer on and all that sort of stuff, because they would have had either a billy can or like a dunny can or a septic tank or something like that. I think they had a septic, yeah. So.
And you also have a really strong Hungarian influence.
Yes.
And a Gypsy influence.
Yes, that's my father's side. Yeah.
Yeah. So, can you share a little bit of his story and also of his mom? It's just like a movie, and I just must ask you because it's too interesting not to ask.
Yeah. Well, my father's interests, as you can see, he was fascinated by nature, especially Australian animals and plants were so different to where he came from. And his mother was also fascinated by Australia's wildlife, and her dream when she was in Hungary, cooking up all the fruits and things that they'd grown. They lived a very self-sufficient lifestyle in Hungary. And she used to dream about coming to Australia, and she taught herself English. She was very dedicated. She saw herself as a prophetic dreamer, so she'd feel like she could tell what was going to happen in the future and things like that. And I think those kind of intuitive practices came from her family. Her maiden name was Tigani, which is the gypsy from, and they were from the Lake Balaton area. I know that much. That's where my father was born. She played the violin, which is a very gypsy instrument. She also played, she also did big tapestries and wove big rugs. And
was she stealing horses like all the other gypsies?
well, they had horses too. They were the horse people from Lake Balaton. I looked it up on the web to find it's still, those tribes are still there, and you know, I'd love to go there one day and connect with that side of the family. But my grandfather, he was a Hungarian man who married my nana. He was more from the city. He was an artist, a jeweler, and a photographer, and he played the piano as well. But I think his attitude to the gypsies was different, so it was sort of seen as shame. And I think when he brought her into his world, you know,
that's a
there was a bit of a funny. It was looked down upon and everything, but they were in love, and you know, they had established their family together.
He must have liked her music.
Yeah, well, they used to sing and play music together. I've got old recordings. He was fascinated with technology, my grandfather, and he was an early photographer. He had all these old, you know, Dad got into it too, the reel-to-reel filming, and so Dad also took on, you know, the first video cameras that came out. He was always making videos, so you know, they had that interest in visual culture and recording your history and the world around you. He had that fascination with nature. So that's when he came to Australia. I think he had his music as well, so the music passed on. Music and art's so important. He started playing drums in rock and roll bands in Sydney and went to Surf City and used to perform there. And then they got to Bandstand and they were about to have their debut, which was like Countdown in the 60s. And something happened, two of the band members didn't show up, and so they missed out. But they did support Johnny O'Keefe, that was their claim to fame. And so they were a pretty good band. And when I was growing up, I learnt the drums too, because it was just amazing. All the things Dad did was so interesting, and I just loved it. And,
so do you have influences, like, do you have the band influences? Like, do you like Metallica, for example?
Well, actually, the surf music that my father used to play, the Aussie surf music, that's what I love. The rockabilly, the old 50s.
I really love it.
It has an Eastern influence too.
Yeah.
All the sounds of the percussiveness, the drums are the big focus. They actually were influenced by Eastern music originally. Some of those surf musicians like Dick Dale and I think Link Ray, and like there's all these really big names in that sort of area. So I think those two areas I loved, but I also loved Minoy Oil when I was growing up because of their activism. Yeah, so definitely the Aboriginal cultural activism as well as about nature, protecting nature.
And that's a really big part of your life, isn't it? To link your family history, your connection to the land where you live. So you live in paradise.
Paradise.
Jervis Bay is one of the most beautiful places in the world, and for me, this is a place where I feel at home in Australia. That's why I keep coming here. It's just got that feeling of belonging and safety, and I just can't get enough. It's a very special place for me. So when I met you a few weeks ago at the Sea Change exhibition, I've never actually seen the type of art you do, and it's I love to be surprised, you know. I love to be shocked, and I love to be made think and wonder, and I really appreciate when something does this to me. And you know, we have so little opportunities to truly marvel at something because the predictability and the technology age that we live in. How would you describe your paintings in the best way?
Well, I think I come from that, that European tradition of wanting to record nature and the world around. That's what Dad was trying to do with his taxidermy, is to make a record of nature that's around him. And I think for me, with drawing and painting, initially that was my focus as well, is to record. My fascination was animals and plants, but so I was always drawing animals, and I think once
Did you
I
have
got
a favourite animal?
well, when I was young, I did a lot of birds and horses. They were the main ones, I think. Stories where they'd be like people, and I'd draw all these. I spent hours drawing stories that were, the characters were animals, and things just so I could draw them really. And often I'd be one of the animals.
So how were you with horses? Because I could never draw a horse.
Oh, it was. I think too, because my peers would always want me to draw horses for them too. That was another
It's
thing.
a tough
It was
one,
this
yeah.
big thing. Yeah, and also horses were. My father would say that was an important animal to draw because of the cultural significance of the horse, and so I draw horses a lot. I never had a horse. We never could afford horses, but my daughter is now really into horses. She'd love to have her own horse, and I've sort of her father and I have kind of tried to get her into as many horse camps and things as possible, so she's very familiar with horses in a physical sense.
It's an expensive
It is.
hobby.
That's the thing. Yes, but so when I went to university to paint, to do painting and learn how to oil paint, and my
So that's the university in Canberra, isn't it?
no, that was I went out west. I was really idealistic about, I didn't like industry, so I didn't want to go anywhere where there was industry like Wollongong or Newcastle. I didn't want to go anywhere where it was a city because it was too smog. I went out to the bush. I didn't know anybody.
I was the same with my art school actually.
Really?
I never wanted to go and live in Prague and study in Prague.
Yeah.
And I went into this beautiful fairy tale town that was just so sleepy and romantic.
Yeah.
And no industry. It was clean. It just had a really nice feeling. It was something I was always aware of, the impact of our environment. Just the subtleties that maybe sensitive creatives feel more. As a that it's not really nice to have it as a part of daily life. But that's really interesting comment.
It was quite odd. My first love was an Indigenous boy, but he wasn't from here. He was a Wiradjuri boy. His family comes from out west, and
did you meet in the bush?
No, I met him just at school. But it's so strange because I didn't realise at the time. I think I remember him mentioning he was from the Wiradjuri nation, and then when I went out to Wagga. I didn't make the connection at the time, but I ended up living in Wagga, that area, for over 10 years. So the Wiradjuri area became very familiar to me. It's sort of a river country, and the Murrumbidgee, and I met people from the Wiradjuri community and ended up doing a lot of big public painting artworks with them, and I even did a collaborative illustrative piece with story illustration for Pauline McLeod, who was a Wiradjuri storyteller, quite well known. And then I met some of this man's relatives out there. Some of them, one boy in particular had the same name, and just these amazing connections, and all to do with country and knowing the country and the culture of the place, the language of the place. That became really important to me. And so when I went on later on to apply to
was it something that you were already living with, in your family environment and your lifestyle?
Yeah.
But was it the exposure to the Aboriginal culture that brought you the awareness that this is what it is, and that it's so important to have it as a lifestyle?
Yeah, it's happened from a young. It was all blended together because growing up here, the Wreck Bay community and the other Aboriginal communities in more urban sort of environments like Nara, their culture was really strong. But I grew up at school. I was exposed all the time to Aboriginal English, to awareness, the stories, some of the languages was still there in the Aboriginal English, and just I was immediately attracted to the fact that the people in the community knew the story of the place that was so familiar to me. That was the story of it. That was the language of this place. And so I started, to really focus straight away on being around, forming friendships with Aboriginal kids my own age, and learning from their elders. So we had quite a few elders throughout my upbringing. Laddie Timbry was a very important one. He made it his life goal to go out into the communities and the schools and teach culture. And he has strong connections to Sydney, to the Eora, and there is strong connections to Sydney in this area. So the Dharawal is a language group that comes down to Bomaderry from Sydney, and a lot of that language group is here in this area, and this is the Durga language area, which goes further down south. So, you know, I started to become aware of all of this, the culture and language of the place. And then, so when I had the opportunity to research, I got a PhD scholarship through the ANU. I thought my dream is to learn about Aboriginal culture and language somewhere where painting is really significant. And I was going to go to the Kimberleys, and then when I discovered Western Arnhem Land and the rock art, biggest rock art galleries in the world, and it's all about painting animals was one of the main things, and that was my passion. And I could not believe that was the most life-changing experience to go up there and in a place where, you know, European language and culture is the minority, and everyone is speaking the language of the place. It's just phenomenal, because living in a country like Australia where the main dominant culture is from another place, to go to Australia, a place in Australia, and this is the culture of the place. You know, that was just such a beautiful experience. Just to hear everyone speaking the language of the land around me, and, you know, absorbing that, and just everywhere you went there was a creation story about the place that the language was built to tell, you know. And I learn about all the colours and where they can be found in the natural environment, and that they all have a significant story that's connected with an ancestral spirit, usually an animal type spirit or a human type spirit. One of them being obviously the rainbow serpent, Meliod. So just seeing that ancient painting as well, and seeing paintings of macropods that have been extinct for thousands of years painted on rocks, you know, and sorcery paintings where, you know, the belief is painting was so powerful that it could make something happen in the world. You do a painting of something that you want to happen, usually something not very nice, or even something nice as well. Like there was lots of sexual sorcery paintings as well. And, you know, and the belief was this will happen now because I've painted it. Painting was so powerful. And yeah, I couldn't believe it, because I knew painting was a powerful thing. You know, Dad's family had sort of imparted that onto me, that making pictures was a really, really important practice to participate in. And so that transferred quite easily. So, yeah.
Was it something that was to get the exposure to that community? Was it really exclusive? Was it through the school, or how unique and how really special it is for someone to be accepted into the community? So for people who, you know, who are listening or watching and they are not familiar with the Aboriginal culture, it's a little bit like a gypsy culture, and that's why I love it personally, because I grew up with gypsies and I love them, and you know, anyway, it's a culture that is fascinating.
Yeah,
and
music
lively.
and art is very important in both.
So I have this affinity with the Aboriginal culture and the fascination of learning through their culture about the land, you know, because I have a son here, so I want him to have the same love and appreciation of Australia, and knowing the significance of the places. You live in a place that it's that it's like a harbour for Canberra, which is capital of Australia.
I know, so
in middle of the mountains. So and there is this funny harbour in middle of nowhere that says that it's part of ACT, which is funny. And the Wreck Bay community
is in ACT.
It's in
I know.
it's in ACT, and it's this isolated coastal community, Aboriginal coastal community. I only just recently learned that there is even school. I had no idea. But it's again, it's a very secluded community, and it's not just a place where you can drive there and just sort of see how the Aboriginal live.
I think that used to happen until the community. You know, obviously you've got friends and family you can go and visit. It's not closed. You don't have to go through a gate or anything.
But for someone like me, example,
that used to happen a lot.
Yeah.
People would come from out of town and just show up and look around. But
I would love that, of course.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure I can take you to meet people and things. But that did happen a bit. But
obviously
times have changed.
But
and
you're
there's more sensitivity and understanding.
Right.
But you know, being treated like a sideshow or something was a little bit. But it still happens in Arnhem Land. It happened a lot when I was there.
But your dad was a part of that community, and he was.
He was a plumber as well, so he worked a lot on the houses in Wreck Bay.
Oh, that's practical.
Yeah, that's another way how we got to know everyone. He even took on one of my friend's brothers, Billy, as an apprentice, an Aboriginal boy that had family ties to Wreck Bay, and you know we were sort of into. You know, my mother grew up with local Aboriginal peers as well, growing up here, and so everyone knew us because we've been here for a long time and went to school here, and you know, so you're part of the community. So when I talk to people now, you just say who you're from, who's your parents, and everyone knows that that's kind of what happens in a community. Everyone passes down sort of.
So that's sort of what happens in any community.
Yeah.
But I have friends who are part of hip hop music scene, and they're based in Darwin, and they travel around Australia and go into these little communities that are very private, and they do hip hop workshops. It's all very fun. And when I first came to Australia 20 years ago, I was really surprised that when I had the comments that when you meet someone for the first time in Darwin, you know, someone who is Aboriginal, how they really ask you the questions about family, where is your family from? They really try to connect with you on such a basic human level. You know, they don't ask you what you do or where you live or you know, all the things.
It's not like a cosmopolitan type understanding of each other. It's more about who are you? What's your culture? Where's your family? Where are you from? Where are you from? You know, because where you're from is everything.
That's right.
Because the land is, you belong to the land of where you come from. And to be away from that, where you come from, is a really, really scary big thing to move away from all of those historical ties. And I mean, for Aboriginal people, that goes back for thousands of years, that tie to that place in their ancestral lineage and stuff like that, you know. And I think when you come from cultures that come from somewhere else originally, and even though you're born here, I think that's what's happened to me. I'm kind of, what is the culture of the place where this is the only place I know, kind of thing. This is where I come from. But it's like, I don't, you know, I wasn't born into knowing the culture of the place until I actually met other people around me and started to connect. And I think, as you're saying, going into a community like Arnhem in Goombalanya is the name of the community, and especially when English is not the first language, and so you're speaking a different language too. Most people did know some English, but you know, I wanted to speak Goonwingu. I didn't want to speak English, so I wanted to learn. And I think my attitude too to you know, you can easily go there and put up barriers and say, right, I'm not learning the language, and I'm not becoming part of the family kinship system, which is what happens. in order for you to fit in, you become part of the kinship system, and that's in order for you to be responsible for others and for others to be responsible for you. It's a survival thing. It's also a resource thing, sharing resources, and that's scary because it feels like everything's been taken away from you in a way and shared around, but you need to realise that it all comes back to you. So it's like this, everyone pulls their resources and everyone becomes part of it, and according to your kinship name is who you're responsible to and who's responsible for you. So, I got Algangila was my name, and then that meant I was certain people's daughter, I was certain people's sister, I was certain people's, certain people were my brothers, fathers, grandfathers.
How is it compared to your birth family?
Yeah, it was sort of the same in a way. Like, we all look after, my family's quite big and strong, we all look after each other. Family is very important. But it's beyond just blood related family. It's like, the kinship system allows people who aren't related to still be responsible for each other. It's a really ancient system that worked for all that time. People survived in Australia without all the modern, like, even in terms of the old European ways, the survival on the land was so highly sophisticated. The knowledge of everything that was happening in nature around and the way that humans were integrated into it was pretty seamless, like from what I've been learning. And now it's been revealed by Uncle Bruce Pascoe, for example, his latest book, Dark Emu, about just going even further into the sophistication of the agricultural systems that were developed and the architectural designs of things. It was advanced. And this is the appreciation of this intricate language-based knowledge of the place. It's just unbelievable how much there is to learn, and how frightening it is that some of that knowledge might have, because of colonisation and the loss of language in a lot of places and things, and those sleeping languages, trying to bring them back, trying to bring that knowledge back. I think we have to think in terms of things being living, so culture being living, and that it's always within the people and coming out of the people. So, someone's born tomorrow and they become the person where the culture comes through, and it's always there. So it's like beyond just our finite lives, that ancestral thinking about time. That's what Aboriginal culture is about, is that the idea of the dream time, or that dreaming, that time itself is just permeates the past, present, future is all interconnected, and this awareness, that living awareness that at any moment that culture comes through someone who's not even born, So it's not that passing down that idea that things will be lost, that faith that the culture and the land will speak to you anyway. It's always there. I like that way of thinking, because, especially when you're surrounded by extinction and things like that, I like the idea that the land will always know and will bring back to itself, all through people, what it needs to heal, or what it needs to people to know. We've got to stay positive. I think.
No, you had such a massive mindset. Usually that happens for people when they go through some really big trauma, and they radically shift their thinking and their entire perspective on life, with living more gratitude and awareness. It just sounds absolutely life-changing, your experience in these communities. And I have one last comment to, because I still want to ask you about your art. And so much. What I really loved was that there is no fear of dying in those communities, and the way how it's collectively embraced as a very spiritual, continuing experience of something totally natural. Have you experienced? I do have a few Aboriginal artists that I have interviewed, and we had really long personal conversations that I just didn't expect. I was just going in there in the very open mind, and I thought I would be happy to sort of take what they give,
Yeah.
because I didn't want to force anything on them. And I met Uncle Wayne near Newcastle last year, and that was really big eye opener for me for the Aboriginal culture. And I especially loved the way he was talking about the continuity and when people are dying. So for them there is no fear when it comes to that. Have you experienced that when you were living in those communities? Was there event? But it's one thing it's to hear about it, right? But in our culture we got our existence. Well, not all of us, but people who are sort of more religious. The fear of God, and then the concept of heaven and hell. They don't have that, and that's pretty wild, because
They have frightening ancestral spirits still, though. There is fear. There's in this particular community, the fear of sorcery was quite big. So the reasonings behind events that would happen in the community were attributed more, I found, to the ancestral spirits or ancestral places having impacts on people than they were to, like actual events that led to that particular thing happening, like someone dying or something happened, someone having an affair with someone or whatever it was. The explanation of that usually came down to that person went to that ancestral site and that's why that happened to them, or this person did sorcery on this person, that's why they died. That means, like, it was, I haven't actually been in a community like that before where sorcery was and the ancestral spirits of the place had more agency than actual
reason.
The reasoning of this event led to this event, sort of causal effect. It was more about these things happen for another reason, like a more significant reason in a way. So it's that, and I can relate to that a bit in terms of the way that the Eastern European culture also has that sense of superstition about why things actually happen.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah. And I actually had my tarot deck with me because tarot was something that my Hungarian nana, that idea of divination sort of came through her, and I learnt about it in my 20s and started practicing and discovering things about that. Anyway, I brought this deck with me because I was interested to see what this sort of practice, how it was perceived. And the men that I showed in the community, they were so frightened. And I mean, it was an amazing... I pulled the first card they pulled out. Yeah, the first card they pulled out was the card that showed a black man and a white woman standing there. Like, it was actually the lover's card, but it was, this man was like very frightened when he saw that picture because it was like representing exactly what was happening right there. And he sort of threw the cards away, and there was a fear that type of belief system is really strong. But in terms of death, I think at that time repatriation was happening. They were bringing back bones and other human remains that were stolen from the rock shelters in the 1948 scientific expedition. It's an American and Australian scientific joint effort to collect as many specimens of animals, plants, and human remains as possible, and it went all into the Smithsonian, this massive big museum institute that's in Washington, partly in Washington and other places. Anyway, so they would try and repatriate or bring back their ancestral remains, and I remember one man at a conference, one of the men from Western Arnhem Land, Wilford, his name, he actually, or Balang was his name, he actually said that his only comment was that the bones would be scratching, trying to get home, trying to get out of the box, that they need to go home. And I think when you're talking about fear of death, I think if an Aboriginal person was at home in their country and they were dying, I don't think that fear, that same amount of fear would be there, because, you know, this is where I belong. That sense of belonging is really powerful. So, you know, I'm going back to my country, I'm in my country, but I think if you're an Aboriginal person in somewhere far away from your country and you were dying, I think you would be fearful. I think you would be frightened. And it's that feeling. I had the same thing. I had to come home. I got to my midlife and I needed to come home, and seriously it was like a really strong, powerful force calling me home, and I, you know, I'm glad because I got to spend those, you know, 5 last years of my father's life with him. And, you know, he went home, but, you know, he went to Hungary late in life for the first and only time, back to where he came from. But yeah, I think he, as you were saying, that feeling of home, he being here, he came back here and he said, no, this is home. And he had that sense of, you know, peace, that this will be where he passes away and this is where he has established himself. And so, you know, it's a bit of, I think it is about, I feel like the fear of dying comes from you not being settled, maybe, you not being home where you feel home is, or you're not feeling like you've done everything you need to do before you die, or there's something that, to me, that's where fear would come.
Maybe that was like your dad when he was frantically
He was frantically doing things.
He still had things to do.
Yeah, but I think we had a big retrospective of his taxidermy. At the time he died, he designed it and everything, and he went into intensive care. And he died the night before he was about to present his speech. So my brother and I presented for him. And it was at Bundanon. It was in the Riversdale, this beautiful setting. And, you know, we'd had a joint exhibition in Nowra that while he was in intensive care as well. So it's like he'd gone out on a high, you know, and he'd been playing music in his band before he went into hospital. And, you know, they made a recording for him. He sat in intensive care listening, and they were saying, you know, hope you get better soon, Tid, you know, we miss ya. And then they had the music playing that they'd recorded, and, you know, just, he did feel like, you know, he'd done all his, you know, and that he passed things on to me too. And him and my mum, they're like the most amazing love story, you know. They've stayed together, you know, all their lives. Yeah, so it was really special, and I think he was ready to go. So
Must be exhausting.
I know.
To be so busy creating the whole life.
I know. I just think, have I done enough?
How was it for you to spend pretty much the beginning of your life with him? So, you know, like you were saying, you were like his shadow.
Yeah, that's the shadow thing.
And then have the privilege of his last 5 years.
Yeah, it was really special. It was special for him, it was special for me. It brought him, he was after he lost his eye from cancer in 99, he'd gone from being a big powerful man to quite a frail man almost overnight. He went into a depression for a few years, you know, trying to find who he was again. Like he was a plumber and he'd been doing his taxidermy, but you know, he hadn't really been playing music for a long time, and he hadn't been drawing and stuff like that. And when I came back, I brought him out of his depression through drawing. He just started drawing again.
So did you draw
and music.
animals? So what did you do? Did you walk in the nature and just...
Yeah, he used to sit down on the beach and draw. He used to sit in the bush and draw. He was always outside. He was an outside person. He'd sit and look at he'd stay up there all, you know, part of the night looking at the stars. it's hard to get him inside really. He was always out there.
My mum is like that.
Yeah, he created his whole world outside. You can see the backyard's just this little world of Dad, and I think, and he started playing music at the men's shed and where my mum worked, so she can make that connection for him, and he just, you know.
So the men's shed, I'm so glad you mentioned it.
Yeah.
I'm not a churchgoer. I'm very spiritual, but I have a conversation with a friend who is very dedicated churchgoer.
Yeah.
And she was telling me about, we had a conversation about mental health and men and the men's shed.
Yeah.
And I just loved the idea. And I thought it's a shame that they have religious attachment, because more people would go there.
Well, this one hasn't got a religious. My mother's a practicing Catholic. She's very devout. It's her personal spirituality. And he was, it's not a religious men's shed, but it's just a place where men can get together.
Yeah.
You started out with carpentry, but it's so much more. My dad started music there. He was basically the driving force behind getting a band. So the whole fact that there's a band, the men's shed band called the Pirates, was my father's legacy. It's still going. You know, he had one eye. It was named after him. And and he just, you know, he was like that. Even at that time, he was like real powerful character, quite assertive, say what he thinks kind of thing. I don't know if it's a typical Magyar thing, you know, the Hungarian. And he, you know, he made an impact wherever he went, no matter what at time of his life. And I found that at his funeral, these people came out of the woodwork and explaining what an inspirational impact that Dad had on their personal lives or their personal journey. Yeah, so there was a lot of that. He even taught a few people, one man in particular, Danny Days, about taxidermy, and it just became one of the biggest parts of his life too. You know, or in his plumbing trade, some of the people that were struggling at tech because of language difficulties or whatever, Dad, who had the biggest language barrier, he, you know, his language is quite different to English. He just inspired them all to achieve, because he overcome great adversity, you know, like, just with his music as well, like inspiring people who never picked up an instrument in the men's shed to. The men's shed band is huge. It's just like all these people keep adding to it. It's just become this inspiring part of the men's shed where music has lifted people out of, you know, out of sort of depression or isolation or whatever, health problems, whatever it is, to just enjoying life at that moment, playing and being.
What a gift.
It is really, and drawing's the same. Any kind of arts practice is so meditative, so self-expressive, that you forget everything, all your problems, your pains, and then you've produced, and it all comes through in it anyway. Doesn't matter what you do, even if you're trying to do some exact thing that you've planned out, you know, part of you comes through into that piece. And I think any art object has its own agency, and it speaks to people. You know, it's a cultural object. You know, no matter what.
So now when we are at your back to your
the
art,
art.
your art is you produce these beautiful shrouds that have well, for me as an observer, I'm not gonna probably say it the way you would introduce your art, but they have this incredibly stained layers from the decomposed animals you find, and some of them have even shapes like a bird or bats, and then you use the different ochres, the colors, and it's out of this world, and it's beautiful, and there's nothing morbid about it, and it's earthy and natural, and it's really sweet. I remember when we met, I just thought, that's so weird and wonderful at the same time. And then I was thinking, you know, like the size that I would really go for big animals. Like you do it, you're just doing it big, like a kangaroo or horse. It's like you should get the shape. How did you end up doing this type of art that is really your signature at the moment?
Yeah, well, as I was talking before, when I first went to Wiradjuri country to do my first degree in visual art, I brought with me some dried animals, mummified animals that my father had, and I did start collecting subjects. Just I'd find a dead bird and I'd bring it into the studio, or I'd find a dead mouse or whatever it was, and they became my subjects. And I love life drawing and life
Do you ever
painting.
talk to them? When you do you know, like the Tom Hanks in the castle?
No, not really. But they, as soon as I transform them into a painting, they become part of me. I guess that's some type of personification
How would
thing.
you explain that? Like,
Well, it was. I started thinking about it obviously when I started having to write about my work. Why am I doing this? And I realised that growing up with this room here, with all these little animals appearing all the time, like they look, you know, almost alive, some of them. And when you're a child, seeing them, and they become like little characters in your world, like that you do feel like they're looking at you, that they're part of you. And when you
it's
play,
like an animated movie.
yeah, when you play as a child, these little, you know, objects become, they're sort of, you know, they're not alive, but at the same time they are. They're embodied.
Yeah.
You can embody them with life through yourself. Yourself just gets embedded in everything. And I think that awareness is there when something's transformed through you into a painting, even though it is the entity, you know, like the object or the taxidermy, which is not really like it's an object, but it's not. The dead body. The dead body is a strange phenomenon. It's a subject that has become an object. So you still see the subject, spirit of the subject within that body. Animal, human, whatever. Seeing a dead body.
You can do humans.
Yes, well, I have obviously my family members. I have, you know, been either in the presence of them dying or being with their body once they've passed away, and yeah, that sudden awareness that person, the subject, the person who has the spirit and is living in that self, he's gone. He's not there anymore, but their body is like, it has become this sacred object. Like it's not alive, but still them. It's a hard thing to
No,
describe.
yes, I've seen a lot of people dying, and it wasn't scary. It was really, really special and beautiful, actually, to see what happens after, just the stillness of the body, not being scary.
Yeah, there's like a rest that comes over their all their features, everything's just rested from work now. But I think with my painting practice too, I started to question that objectification thing, like, as well. When I started to do the PhD, I had a really powerful, I had some really great supervisors, but one particular lady,
Yes.
Vivian Binns. Have you heard of Vivian Binns? She's a very powerful woman, and her art's very strong and personal and just cultural and everything. But she's just pushed me further than any lecturer's sort of ever done before by, you know.
Did she know your background with?
Yeah, we all had to introduce ourselves and everything, and I mean, she just felt like, you know, I'd been painting pictures of the animals, and she's saying, well, you know, you need to investigate this further. You need to push further. You can't just sort of stay at that point. You know, it's like a barrier. And she's going, and then I think one afternoon she said, why don't you just put the animal on the canvas? So like, why don't you just, you know, the dead animal, this dead animal. And she connected me up with a sculptor who was into animals, Stephen Holland, amazing sculptor. He was married to, well, partners with a farmer, a fifth generation farmer, Tony, who had a farm in the Monaro, and that's where he lived and had his studios. And so I went out there, and that's where I started doing my decomposition experiments. The first being, on the way there, we saw there was a dead, it was actually on this big male kangaroo had been hit by a car, because the road goes straight to the snow past their property, so lots of traffic, and had hobbled up to one of the big trees on the property and died there. And he said, oh, there's a dead kangaroo out on the property, you can start there. And so there I come out there with my canvas, and the first one I did, I just rolled, it was very heavy, rolled his body onto the canvas just under the tree. You know, he decomposed, and then I dragged the canvas out. That was the first experiment that I did. And I was amazed by the weight. The bones from the ribs, for example, were imprinted from the weight of the body. You could see the outline. You could see where the areas where the blood was really thick, and the colour that made on the canvas. You could see where the dirt had collected around the body, made a drawing, you know, just from the wind, the blowing the canvas, making folds. The whole environment was collected onto the canvas, including the subject. And that was like a breakthrough when I realised the subject and the environment can create their own image. And I almost felt redundant. What was I? I was the person assembling this event to occur, but you know, it took a long time for me to, you know, once I had developed a really refined process of how to create these shrouds. You know, I ended up putting them on a sprung bed base, so there was air underneath, and then the canvas, and then putting bodies on, putting mesh over the top so that animals didn't drag the bodies away. I had to develop all these little things and to get the ultimate, you know, the ultimate print, or not a print really, but impression. And it just took, you know, it took a fair while, but after stretching them up on the canvas and realising, oh, I could size it with a natural material, the rabbit skin glue, so it's preserved. I know that sounds strange, but it's sealed, it's preserved. I can put the canvas in vinegar to deodorise it. I can boil it in eucalyptus leaves to kill bacteria. There was all sorts of things. Leave it in the sun. You know, I had to work out ways of making this diabolical material of death suddenly able to be in the gallery. How am I going to make that transition to present this amazing finding? You know, there is sometimes still an element of the smell in some of the bigger bodies, and that's sort of part of the work. But you know, you have to be a bit careful. Some galleries have sort of been a little bit, we can't bring that into the gallery, you know. So, you know, and just working out ways of making it still safe, and you know, still, but you know, just me putting myself back into a work like that. Where do I, you know, it took a long time. I spent a lot of time with, you know, the shroud object, which is like, it has that agency, it has that presence, like a being, the spirit is still there in a more powerful way than what I ever imagined. So that me then interacting with the subject is even harder, because you know, I think, well, if I put myself into this, you know, so I'd start putting myself beside, like I'd put the image of, you know, I'd paint the image of the decomposed body of the subject next to the impression that the body decomposing had made. You know, just to say, I'm here, but I'm not, you know, I'm not going to blemish your own representation of yourself. But then sometimes I would have this compulsion to work into the stain, into the self, the subject self, and you know, so there was all these. Each work would have its own, you know, it would call me to do a certain thing. Some I couldn't touch. Some that I've still got here that I haven't touched. It's almost like I need to spend some time with those specific subjects, you know, those specific shrouds before I'll know what to do. But over time I developed more and more ways, like a bigger toolkit, I guess you'd call it, of options. And I started working with bitumen a lot, because most of the animals were roadkill, and bitumen is it's a substance that's, you know, it's formed the roads, it's made the cars appear, but at the same time it's a substance from nature that's like nature broken down to its most viscous sort of point, like this big, massive broken down vegetation. So it's an amazing stuff, but then it's connected with oil, you know, which is like it just says a lot about our culture, this cultural substance, bitumen. It's crude oil almost, it's like, you know, and I love that idea that the substance of the work itself holds the meaning, holds the culture in it. So that's, you know, learning about the ochres too. When I use the ochres, I know where they come from, I know what that colour means, you know, its culture connection to place and the power that it has as a substance. So if I use it, it's like, you know, this is a substance of Australia, of this place. Well, not Australia, but a substance of Western Arnhem Land, you know. It's a continent full of nations. It's not, Australia is you know, one of the, if you talk to Pirate, he'll tell you all about the notion of Australia. He's an Indigenous black artist. And yeah, so the substances themselves, and when I use oil paint, I know that is a substance that has developed from European culture, and it's a very powerful cultural substance. Oil painting has its own traditions and the colours that are used too, where they come from. You know, I started learning a lot about that. The blue from Afghanistan, for example, the lapis lazuli, I'd love to go and collect. It's a blue rock from the caves there, you know. That's where ultramarine comes from, but, you know, it has roots in a place. All the colours that we can find.
So is it something you've been researching as well? Like
yeah, I'd love to extend that and actually go to these places, you know, where they come. Sienna, you know, that colour sienna comes from Sienna in Europe. They all come, all these colours come from the earths of different places originally.
That's so wonderful. The story of the colour.
Yes,
Yeah.
Stories of the colour. Yeah. So everything I do is is very thought out in terms of what substances I apply. They all, and the types of representation I'm using those substances for. So when I use the ochre now, after I've been developing it, I'm working into the ground usually with the white, the delic, which is the species of the rainbow serpent galliod, or the pipe clay from Wreck Bay, which is that's the whitest white you can get here, which is like a clay. Saying, you know, these are the places that I've been, and this is the ground of the work coming in. You know, this is the environments coming in that inform the work. And when I'm representing the image of the decomposed animal in my own European style of, you know, photographic representation with the oil and the bitumen, they're the substances from the European culture, and this is the way that European culture represents itself, sort of thing, you know. Even though obviously representation in European culture has gone through all different types of changes. Yeah, but just that natural history tradition, I guess, in terms of nature.
Yeah, I'm going to post links to your art because you know, it must be experienced and seen for people to really appreciate
Yeah.
the impact of it, because you know, like this particular painting we were standing in front of a few weeks ago, it just looked like a star constellation to me.
Yes.
It was so beautiful, and it just was morbid. It was really lovely and sweet, and I'm curious, what do did you get feedback from the Aboriginal community? How do they feel about it, or, you know?
I talked a bit about, I didn't create any shrouds while I was there. I mainly did ochre painting. By the end of my time there, I was sitting with the artist painting, and to the point where when the tourists would come, they would direct their questions. Yeah, photograph me, direct their questions at me, and I'm saying, well, you should speak to the Gumwingu artist sitting right here next to me, but, you know, because of the language barrier and things. But when I showed pictures and described to some of the artists what I did, what I developed, the understanding was just clear. There was no, oh, that's weird, or that's confusing or strange. And because the animal body has been used for creative practice in their culture for forever, and that just seemed like an elementary type of thing to do, representing the animal. So that was nothing new. And the way that I was looking at the animal and representing like dried animals that I would have, I actually had a toad, a dried toad, which they'd only just reached Arnhem Land, the cane toads, and it was causing devastation. And I'm like the toad, the European coming here. I'm like the introduced species, painting my toad next to them painting the traditional. I thought that was ironic and interesting, but yeah. And no, they, I was being taught also how to do the rarok, like this cross hatching, the, really, really detailed ways of representing the living essence of the animal, as well as having, ceremonial significance in certain paintings. This cross hatching that was developed as a decorative, but also to say, the animal's alive, living, shimmering, it's just this really beautiful way of painting. I don't know if you've seen the crosshatch.
Probably not.
In Western Arnhem Land, it's specific. It's not the dots that you would see in Central Australia. It's this other way of the decorating or showing the life essence is with the crosshatch. So you just do all these parallel lines, and then go over it's hard to describe, but anyway.
Sounds great.
Yeah, it's really hard to do. You need a really steady hand.
No, I don't think I would have to see that.
Yeah. But no, they're making the even though I didn't do them there, I think the rock art, when I first saw a big kangaroo rock, like ancient rock art, the similarity between the way it was represented and the way that the red ochre, particularly the gunojbi, the way it would seep into the rock and stain it really deep into the rock, was exactly what the stain was like with the shroud, with the body of the kangaroo. And I remember one of my lectures putting up a picture of the stained rock art and then the stain of the shroud of the same animal, and they almost look identical. It's like the body is life size.
It's like they just
the bodies were always life size. Yeah, when an artist represents an animal, they always represent them life size. And in Gunwingu painting, the silhouette of the animal is specific to that species. So everyone paints the same silhouette when they're representing that particular animal species. So it was passed down. It's like a master-apprentice painting tradition, sort of the way the salon used to be in Europe, where you'd copy the masters. Well, that's exactly the way Gunwingu painters work. So the young people would sit down and have to copy and do exactly the same painting. So individuality comes through just in your own interpretation, that but in the way that it's represented, they'll always look slightly different. And you'll see the artist's style, but they're representing things in a certain cultural way, and I liked that as well. I think
I never heard so much details about about the inside for the Aboriginal art. I mean, I'm a migrant, and I would like to think I have a little bit different appreciation of the Aboriginal art, and it's my mum brought us up with massive history love, like appreciating art and the stories, and I just find it really fascinating to even hear the story behind the rock art and the size of the animals. Is that part of your lectures? Because you mentioned that you're going around universities and schools teaching culture.
Yeah.
Is that part of how you sort of try to how you bring those two worlds together?
Yes, definitely. I'm part of. When I was younger, I met one of my peers at school, Leon Brown. He's a Wreck Bay kid, and he's Yuin from the Yuin Nation, and he basically we became friends, and his grandfather was an important man in the community. He's a cultural man, and he passed on a lot of his knowledge to Leon, and he was Leon's inspiration. And I met him because Leon brought these poems to school one day and said, my grandfather has done these poems and asked me to do drawings to go with them, but I can't do it. Can you do it for me? And I said, sure, I'd love to. And I immediately, because I was already interested in Aboriginal culture, I'd already read lots of activist Indigenous poetry, and I immediately recognised the poems as being adopted from Kevin Gilbert's poetry. So even as a teenager, I was quite into activism, Indigenous activism and things, and I discovered a little bit about the written culture, and so I did these drawings, and some of them were really sad stories, poems about the loss of culture or loss of lives in the colonial wars and things, you know, like really sad stories. And I did these, you know, I remember one of them was a fire with the woman, which in the poem was referred to as the lubra, which is this, I think, a European way of describing Indigenous women, like almost like a jinn or a lubra or something like that. And I've done her spirit rising through the flames and things like that, you know, drawings that I'd come up with as a teenager. And Leon said, my grandfather was really taken by your drawings and wants to meet you. And I went into the old Husky pub, the way it used to be, and I met this old man, and he had tears in his eyes, and he grabbed my hand and he said, my dream is for, you know, white and black to come together and to grow and learn together and learn about each other's cultures in a positive, you know, he wanted that dream of bringing the cultures together. And Leon and I now, since I've come back here after 20 years of living in other places, we reconnected, we ran into each other, and he said he's been trying to form this corporation in memory of his grandfather called Guruma, which is his grandfather's skin name. And the skin name, Guruma means fighting spirit. And he's formed this corporation, a non-for-profit educational, Aboriginal educational group that basically what we do is try and bring culture and language and arts practice into the schools so that everyone, not just the Indigenous kids, but, you know, particularly them, their children from Wreck Bay, but also anyone who's able to come to do culture learning on country, but also learning about yourself and finding out what you want to do in your life, and trying to engage children that are disengaged from school, especially Indigenous children, because that's quite common, because of the cultural, you know, the vacuum that happens once you get to, especially to high school. But what's happened in Vincennia High, which is amazing, is they've started teaching the local Indigenous language to all the students. As soon as they get to the high school in Year 7, they all learn the local Indigenous language. Even though it's a sleeping language, so meaning it's the language of the place that's not spoken fluently anymore. They've rebirthed it, and everyone.
Do you speak the language?
I've started learning some of the Durga, but I've learned mainly more of the Darwell.
Can you say something?
Could
be anything. I wouldn't know.
I know Walawani is introducing yourself. The Durga. I've mostly been learning Darwell, which about the seasons. So we're in Tagaratuli, which is going into the cold season. So I mainly know words, because that's how we're learning them, in words, rather than, you know, learning sentences and things. But I know Walawani is part of the introducing yourself in the Durga language. It's one of the words. Yeah, I wish I knew, because I didn't go to Vincennia High C. It didn't exist. We didn't learn the local language when I was at high school.
So where did you go? Nara?
No, I've had to learn just through teaching. So when I've been teaching, I've been learning words to teach. Mainly the words that I learnt before were the Gunmingu words that I learned in Arnhem Land. And so through teaching is learning, because you have to learn in order to teach. And because there's teachers now who teach Durga, But as I said, they learn some introductory statements, but they learn a lot of just words like this is the name of this. So that's what happened in Arnhem Land too. You'd learn this is the name of this, either this place, this mountain, this animal, this plant, this food. You know, that's how you would learn the language. Because it's a big thing to learn all the sentence. I don't know, you must have known because you know more than one language.
Yes, I do.
It's like to learn another language. So, you know, I'd love to one day be fluent in these languages. I don't know, I only know a few words in Madhya, for example. I don't know that language because when Dad had got here, he was very adamant about being Australian, you know, because Mum was Australian and she didn't know his home language. Yeah, so we only learnt, you know, how to count to 10 and things like that we asked to learn. So we'd go to Dad and say, I want to do a project on Hungary. I want to learn how to count to 10. I want to learn, you know, except when he used to swear in Hungarian. I learnt those ones. Yeah, the Madhya language. Yeah. So yeah, I pick up language fairly quickly, mainly through writing it down. If I write it down, then it makes me remember. So I can see I'm a very photographic memory picture type person, so I can see the word written on the page and then I can remember it like that. That's actually how I got through my HSC. I used to just memorise essays and I'd in the test I'd picture the page that the words were written on and I'd copy it out from my memory. Then I went really well. I didn't actually remember any of it. It's like just the words written on the page. The subject matter was kind of, you know, arbitrary.
I was sort of wondering, like, we're sitting here in this beautiful room. I mean, it is really mind-blowing. It's just like everything, like spiders and crustaceans and eagles and, you know, dead mouse is hanging on the eagles and possums and it's really a incredible little universe. So how do you see yourself in the community? How do you see your future here in the community? Are you planning to maybe make this more accessible to public, or how do you see your work with you know, your cultural teaching as well and your creative work? And also I wonder, how would your work look like if you were to spend some time in Hungary or Europe, maybe? You know?
Yeah.
Would you still be doing like shrouds with, I don't know, squirrels? And
I think one of the big traditions that I'm fascinated with Hungary is my nana used to weave and do tapestries, and my grandfather would design them. And some of the tapestries he designed, which we haven't got, the ones that she made, they're carpets that had, you know, elephants with 3 or 4 heads holding different things in their trunks, or, you know, pictures of peasant people and kings and all these different floral motifs and all these really unusual little elements all put together in these big designs. And I have them on these old parchments that are all browned and it was grid paper he used to design them onto that she would then stitch from. I would like to recreate them and get in touch with that tradition. I know that tapestry and embroidery is really big in Eastern Europe, and that's one particular thing. I think if I went over there, that would be kind of, I'm imagining that'd be the kind of thing I'd start to get into, as well as like finding the animals and the place and the sense of the place and maybe the colours and of that place that the tradition has. But I think they used to dye a lot of their like all the materials and the things that they'd weave, you know, I keep imagining that I'd get into sort of textiles. Like there was a lot of that happening in Arnhem Land too, so there was like a sign. They'd dye the gumbuban, which is the pandanus. They'd dye it in these big natural dyes that they'd make from collecting bulbs or leaves or other roots of trees, and that these particular colours would come from plants that they'd make they dye the pandanus and then weave it. And I think that is the area that I'd look into a fair bit. I don't know, that attracts me. There's a spinner and weaver group in Vincentia actually that went on and finished doing some really major painting projects at the moment. I haven't got time, but I think that's, your cultural practice and your painting, your arts practice always evolves and changes, and I think even though you might be doing the same things, you're also trying to do new things, and that's where I've started doing, I do a bit of stitching sometimes in my work, say if the canvas rots away or breaks when it's been stretched, I'll sew it back up, like a taxidermy, I'm sewing back the skin. That's what I would think about, I'm repairing, but I'm also thinking about my nana, how she'd stitch, do fine needlework all the time, and that, that part of it as a cultural practice, I'm really fascinated by that as well, and I think that's the area that I would, aside from the music, that's a whole other world. I don't even talk about that. But yeah,
Right.
that stitching tradition. Yeah.
Well, I find fascinating how you found the synergy between, the land and the Aboriginal culture and the big love and passion you have for this land, because it's so beautiful, and you do tell the story so well for people not to judge it for the perceptions that everyone has from the media, but for the beauty and celebrating the nature and the connections. But also you found the connection from your past, and and it's even going to be part of your future, the way you make it come all together.
I'm always bringing my past into my future. I think I'm always collapsing time like that.
Yeah.
That's
how exciting.
I'm actually now with the man that I was with when I was engaged to when I was a teenager, so I've collapsed that time as well. I'm always coming back to where I came from or doing something.
Do you ever surprise yourself? Is this just self-discovery process?
Oh yes, it's always, I'm very, as you say, the superstitious Eastern European side. It's always there, and everything is a sign, and everything is, I'm, everywhere around me, I'm looking for signs and taking notice.
I'm like that too.
Yeah, I think it's quite
always
important.
Looking for signs. Yeah.
I think they're always out there and taking on opportunities when they come, like being a bit of a yes person. Sometimes it's led me up some pretty strange tracks, but gotta be a bit careful. But just always taking on new opportunities and new investigations, being open, as you said before the interview, being open to what might occur in this very moment, and instead of having a set thing about what something should be, just always having that open mind, taking people at face value is important.
Is it something that you have learned, or is it part of your mindfulness practice? So
I think my inner world has always been so big, and kind of when I was really young, I didn't know the difference in a lot of ways between my inner world and they were very integrated. So I was a bit strange. I had a few strange things that I do.
I didn't want to say it loud.
Yeah, things that would happen in my dreams, for example, I think were real, that I was actually able to fly and things like that, I'd spend most of my time with my father, basically the backyard when I was growing up was living animals. So he started with the living, those European traditions of keeping animals for food, and the whole yard was full of turkeys, chooks, ducks, rabbits. I think we even had ferrets at one stage, and just all sorts of animals. And I'd be in there in the pens with them all the time. And I remember one time because in my first degree, visual art degree, I found all these old photos, because my grandfather was a photographer in the early 20th century, and all these old photos, black and white photos from Hungary. I found all the old negs, and I learned how to project them again. And there was a photo of my uncle in Hungary, in the pens, exactly like I was when I was a child, in the pens with all the goats and the animals. He would be in there with them too, and I thought, well, I'm the same. I'm just like him. I just wanted to, I'd pretend that I was one of the animals. My mum would have to call me in for dinner. Time to come in for dinner now. I'd just be they've been crawling around in there for the whole evening, you know, the whole afternoon. And so I think I had that time getting in touch with the animal as part of my, you know, myself early on. And yeah, I think as I've gotten older, there's been a kind of a conscious, a process of becoming conscious of the separations between me and of myself. And I mean, maybe I've just got some humongous ego and I can't see past, I don't know what it was, but anyway, it's some psychological whatever. But arts practice has been really important to me, you know, because otherwise how would I manage this thing, you know? It's been a way of, you know, getting it out, you know, making it conscious, and so that, oh, that's separate from maybe that, you know, myself is out there too. I can kind of, there's other people here. I can, you know, they're part of this experience too. It's not all just me.
It is a full on existence to be a creative, isn't it? You
Yeah,
just get so
that self-obsessed, sort of self-absorbed thing that happens. Yeah, and you extend, yourself just starts to grow and extend in this.
But it is necessary, isn't it? If you want to create, be creative, stay creative, and make it into your main thing, you need to have that absolute self-belief that what you're doing is awesome.
Yeah, is important and is worth doing.
That's right.
Or that I have to do it to be sane.
That's something that I see as a really healthy ego.
Yeah.
You know, the awareness that, you know, when there are so many creatives who don't feel creative enough or accomplished enough, or they're waiting for their work to be perfect, so they don't have the courage to approach someone rather than just, you know. So I think there needs to be that degree of insanity, you know.
Yeah, and that I was taught, you know, all the way through my fine art education in universities, always don't be precious. You know, don't get too caught up with this. Don't to be so precious about this particular thing. Be more experimental in terms of, you know, have failures and move on. That bukash, that's the Madhya word for failure. I learnt that one. Bukash.
That's a good one.
Yeah, that's important. The part of being a failure, part of being a wounded healer, like the Taltosh, the Hungarian shaman, that you have to fall in order to rebuild yourself. You have to, you know, understand what it is to die and be reborn, or to be sick and find yourself again. You know, find that life thread and pull yourself back into the living again. You know, you need to be able to take yourself to those limits, because if you're too precious, you won't let yourself get to the limits, or you won't let yourself fall and then rebuild or find another pathway. That open-mindedness thing again. Yeah, definitely have to. I mean, it's so easy when you get you go onto something good in your practice, and you start doing that, and it's so easy to start narrowing down. Then your focus becomes, you know, and then you need to be able to, you know, bring this back out again at some point, because then it will start to go stale. I think creative practice is like that. It needs to sort of, you know, ebb and flow and move and absorb again to remain living. You know, things can easily get stayed and old, and yeah, creativity is always changing. I think always has to have that fresh, that fresh, unusual, unexpected thing happening. And I think shroud making is always has that element anyway, so it's hard not to keep doing it. It's always surprising. You never really know.
Are you expecting to be surprised?
Yes. I've got my next I guess set. I call them sets of bodies that I've collected or have been given to me. There's just, you know, they collect in my I've got a big chest freezer, and they collect and they build up to a point where I'm ready to do another set, you know. So I've got 2 big sprung bed bases, so I can do a fair amount at one time.
Mm.
So that set has a relationship to each other no matter where the animals have come from, because they create their shrouds together. So they all decompose together in the same site. And so there's a link between them. And I've started, when I make the works from that set, I've started actually exhibiting them as though they're like an irregular jigsaw, that they all link together in some particular way, especially if they do come from the same place sometimes, like those sea creatures from Collingwood Beach. They've washed up in the same place, so they've died in the same waterway.
It's quite beautiful.
Yeah, and so they have a relationship too, you know. But
Like
you know, I'm
after
part of their process between living and dying. You know, I'm part of their dying process. I feel like I'm providing their bodies with a kind of mortuary sort of ceremonial thing, you know, where they're being noticed. For example, they're being collected and tended to. They're being laid, you know, down onto a fabric, and they're in a nice, stable environment where, you know, the sun and the seasons, they're there, and they're able to peacefully, you know, break down. And then that image of them collected is like I feel the shroud is revering that self, that subject, that individual has passed down through, and I've collected their image to revere them, their life. You know, it's sad. A lot of the animals that were hit by cars, for example, there's a real harsh, uncaring kind of feeling about the hit and run. You know, it's like if that was a person, you know, hit and run, leaving the body there to rot. It's recognising the harshness of the machine age, I suppose, like the machine wars that we had, the Second World War. You know, just the machine age, the chemical age. You know, it's a very harsh environment, and the animals are just sort of become refuse in that kind of environment. And their individual souls who've had a life that you know, can be recognised. I think should be recognised. And so yeah, there is that element of mourning, I guess, and you know, more and more animals are dying every day. It's just becoming certain species that I've collected, or my father have collected over time, have gone from being species we used to see all the time, dying naturally or whatever, and that have just now become rare, or you know, the last of their clan coming out of the bush, because that bush is now being developed, so there's nowhere for them to go, and they get hit by a car, or they're suddenly found in people's backyards because there's nowhere else for them to go, and they get eaten by a dog, or they get, you know, there's some really sad things happening. And I think when you're on the end of that process, collecting the bodies, you notice patterns, you notice the types of animals being collected at certain times of the year. You know, for example, when that development first happened at Bayswood, there was a sudden influx of little marsupials. What are they called? Now suddenly can't remember their name. But we never used to see much of them. Like, so every now and then they'd come out. But suddenly they were everywhere, and they were getting hit by cars. Like, they were just everywhere, and they'd been disturbed. They'd obviously been living down in the swamp area there, very thick bushland, and then they'd come out. And they were suddenly in the town, and they were just getting hit by cars all the time and eating people's vegetable gardens, and you know, they were everywhere. And that stuff like that you would notice, because you know, suddenly I was doing shrouds that had this animal in them, and never before had I seen them killed on the side of the road before. It was a really strange phenomenon. It's very sad though, you know. Yeah.
I never thought about it that way, that you know, through your work you will, because you're such a part of land, and
Yeah, you
rhythms
start
of the land.
connecting. Yeah, the rhythms. That's it.
That's
Or
that is really, that's really poetic.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
We have a movie in Czech. It's called the Burner of the Dead Bodies, and it's all kind of black and white 70s movie and very cool, and it's sort of celebrating the life of this quirky old man. And I just had this. It just come to my mind, you know, that it's you, someone who celebrates the nature, and I have just. I have just noticed
strange sense of humour there.
I have just noticed that. So that would be the maybe kangaroo paws.
Yeah, they used to be. Well, this one's always held the whip. But this one over here, I think, used to hold like a rifle.
Yeah, right.
We've gotten rid of all the
That's
rifles
messy.
now because
So,
hunting.
so for people who are listening, these are like a paws that act like little hooks for this electric cable, or it's a whip. It is a whip,
Yeah, it's a whip.
and it holds
Stock
the
whip.
whip. Yeah,
Yeah.
and they've like a little hands up. So
Yeah, it's a little bit going further into
Funny.
the objectification thing that I was talking about. Dad's own views about that were probably a bit different to mine. So my whole process of shrouds, I think letting the animals decompose is kind of counter taxidermy. That yeah. So even though he loved and fascinated with the animals, he also his views about animals were quite harsh.
Yeah.
Because of his upbringing where you kill the animals to eat. That was really strong, and so his perception was that humans were above animals, and animals were there for to do with as we please, and you know.
it's
So
very big in
it's
our
very
culture.
different. It is, yeah.
I have a friend, and she's vegetarian now, and she said that her dad was a very passionate fisherman,
Oh yes.
and he
That's
was
her way of kind of
and
countering.
and he was stuffing the fishes.
Yes.
And they had this kitchen wall, and it was full of this stuffed fish.
Yes, his trophies. His fishing.
And there on the bottom, her mum had a little space to put her little lilies there.
Oh.
and it is just so funny because we were sitting on a taxidermy piece,
Wall.
just like the husky said, and she just goes, "I hate this stuff."
My dad
But,
probably did some of them for him.
Maybe.
It's in us 'cause Dad specialised in fishes. No
But
one
I
else would.
thought that was very funny. Well, thank you so much for this beautiful, enriching conversation, and I have learned so much about the Aboriginal culture and just the significance behind the rock art, and you know, just how it blends beautifully with what you do, the stories of the land, and
Recording of the creatures that inhabit. Yeah.
because you are a storyteller with your work. And thank you so much for your time. I really
Thank you,
appreciate
Petra.
it.
I appreciate your interest in
Pleasure.
what I do.